Hello, this video is based on Chapter 8 from Ecology 5th edition by Bauman and Hacker. Behavioral ecology is one of my favorite topics in all ecology. This is the content you typically see in nature documentaries, animals behaving in remarkable ways. I teach an advanced course in behavioral ecology, which is so much fun because we talk about animals all the time. Oh yeah! This chapter is just a brief introduction. The chapter opens with a gruesome example of aggression in lions. Now, we all know that lions are fierce beasts built to kill. But in the case presented in the chapter, male lions kill infants in their own pride. This is Lion King type of drama. Why do lions and many other species engage in the gruesome behavior of infanticide? Why is it that almost always it is the males that kill the infants? Why do males of most species typically aim to maximize the quantity of mates, but females typically aim to maximize the quality of mates? There are some exceptions. Why do red phalarope females fight for access to males, but males are more selective in their mating partners? These are the types of interesting questions we explore in behavioral ecology, the scientific study of the ecological and evolutionary basis of animal behavior. Notice that I said ecological and evolutionary basis of animal behavior. One can study animal behavior from different angles, focusing on the genetic, developmental, neuronal, or hormonal mechanisms of a behavior seeks to explain how an individual animal is able to perform a specific behavior. Notice I said how. These are called proximate causes of behavior. On the other hand, focusing on the evolutionary history or adaptive value of a behavior seeks to explain why a species acquired a specific behavior. Notice I said why. These are called the ultimate causes of behavior. Behavioral ecologists are primarily concerned with the ultimate explanations of animal behavior. To examine the ultimate explanations of animal behavior, behavioral ecologists must make some assumptions. Behaviors, like anatomical and physiological traits, can be identified and measured. Behaviors have evolutionary histories and have been shaped by natural selection. Similar behaviors in closely related species are likely homologous. Let's critically examine that second assumption, that behaviors have evolutionary histories and have been shaped by natural selection. This would mean that natural selection has favored certain behaviors in a species' past that confer survival or reproductive advantages to individuals with certain behavioral phenotypes. Of course, whether a phenotype is advantageous depends on the environment. The textbook describes a neat example of an adaptive behavioral response in German cockroaches exposed to an insecticide. Because the insecticide was baited with glucose sugar to attract the cockroaches, individuals with an aversion to glucose avoided the poison and survived. Over time, glucose aversion increased in frequency in populations exposed to this sweet insecticide. This is thus an example of adaptive evolution resulting in insecticide resistance. If natural selection was acting on this trait, what else must have been true? If you said heritable variation and differential reproduction, you are thinking like a true behavioral ecologist. Cockroaches in a population must display variation in glucose preference, with some individuals showing an attraction and others showing an aversion toward glucose. And these behavioral phenotypes must be determined at least in part by genes. Further, cockroaches with one behavioral phenotype must consistently produce more offspring than cockroaches with an alternative behavioral phenotype. Now, all this talk about cockroaches feeding leads us to a central topic in behavioral ecology: foraging behavior. Animals, being heterotrophs, must be able to find food to acquire the energy necessary for life's activities. But just as it takes money to make money, it takes energy to get energy. Optimal foraging theory proposes that animals maximize the amount of energy acquired per unit of feeding time. Mathematically, this theory can take on the form of this equation, where E net is the net energy obtained from a food source. E gross is the total energy in a food source. S is the time spent searching for food, and H is the time spent handling the food. The sum of S and H is the effort. The basic idea is that natural selection favors foraging behaviors that yield the highest benefit for the least cost, just as the economy favors businesses that yield the highest profit. It's like going to a restaurant, looking at the menu, and selecting the item with the highest amount of calories per dollar. I actually do this when I go to restaurants. The graph here illustrates a conceptual model of optimal foraging. Study the graph carefully. You should know that the orange line is the blue line minus the red line. Try to describe in words what is happening at points A to F on the x-axis. The main empirical example in the textbook that illustrates a test of the optimal foraging theory comes from an experimental study on great tits from the 1970s. But I like the secondary example better, which comes from a classic observational study on oyster catchers. That example is not illustrated by a figure in the ecology textbook, but I'm borrowing this one from my animal behavior textbook. The Eurasian oystercatcher is a shorebird that eats bivalves such as oysters, clams, and mussels. Oystercatchers must find a bivalve buried in the sand, lift it out, and open it to eat the guts and gonads inside. If you've ever dissected a bivalve, you can appreciate how much effort it can take to open one, especially without a scalpel. Small bivalves are easy to open, but barely have any meat in them. They are almost not worth the effort. Large bivalves have a nice meaty interior, but are almost impenetrable and require too much effort. Optimality theory predicts that there is an optimal bivalve size that provides the most energy per unit of effort. Look at the data in these two graphs. The top graph is the distribution of muscle size among all muscles present in the study area. The bottom graph is the distribution of muscle size among the actual muscles selected by the oyster catchers. You should be able to explain how these data support the optimal foraging theory. You should also be familiar with some criticisms of optimal foraging theory. One of the main criticisms is the fact that life, for many animals, is not all about eating the most amount of food. It is also important to not be food for others. After all, an animal that is well fed but does not survive long enough to reproduce will not pass its genes to future generations. So, prey animals often must resort to eating food of suboptimal quality or suboptimal quantity when predators are present. For example, elk in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem move into the conifer forests when wolves are present, although forests offer less food than the grasslands. When wolves depart, the elk will return to their preferred foraging habitat. Animals thus can alter their behavior based on their perceived risk of predation. Interestingly, their perceived risk of predation can be heightened even in the absence of actual predators. For example, song sparrows experimentally exposed to recordings of predators fed their young less frequently than the sparrows exposed to recordings of non-predators. I'll end with this challenging puzzle. Why do springboks and closely related gazelles stot when pursued by a predator? To give you a clue, consider optimal foraging theory, but from the perspective of the food instead of the forager. Think about it and we'll discuss it together in class.